Good day, grade 9s. We are now going to start with Term 2, Lesson 1, and it will be on demand and supply. In your textbook, it's pages 93 to 104. What we will be discussing in this lesson. What is demand? What is the law of demand? What is a demand schedule? The graphical illustration of the demand curve. What is supply? What is the law of supply? What is the supply schedule? Graphical illustration of the supply curve, and what is market equilibrium? What is demand? Demand is defined as the quantity of a good or service that consumers are willing and able to purchase at different prices. So if you are willing to buy a chocolate bar, let's say for 5 Rand, then that will be your demand. You demand that you want to buy 10 of those chocolate bars because that's what you can afford. Factors that determine the demand for a product is, amongst others, the price of the product. If a product is too high, the price is too high of a product, let's say you are not willing to pay that price for a product, then that will influence your demand. If there's 2 pairs of shoes standing in front of you, and the one pair looks exactly the same as the other pair, but the one pair is 600 Rand and the other pair is 900 Rand, then you would want to rather buy the 600 Rand pair of shoes. Now that is because the price of a product influences your demand. The amount of money you have will also determine your demand. Advertising will influence your demand. The price of other products will influence your demand. If you know that you can get a product cheaper elsewhere, it will influence your demand for that specific product at a specific place or shop. The weather conditions will influence your demand. You will not demand a warm jacket when it's summer. You will not demand an umbrella when it does not rain. So the weather conditions plays a role in your demand. Fashion will also influence your demand. If something is not in fashion, you will not demand it. If something is in fashion, you will have a demand for it. So let us look at the second point of demand. What is the law of demand? The quantity of goods demanded by consumers depends partly on the price of the goods. So the price of goods will influence your demand for that specific good. If the price is low, you will be willing to purchase more of that specific product. But when the price is high, you will want to purchase less. This inverse relationship between the price of goods and the quantity of goods consumers are willing and able to purchase is known as the law of demand. So the law of demand states that the higher the price of a good or service, the lower your demand will be. In other words, if price increase, your demand for the product will decrease. So what is the demand schedule? A demand schedule is a table, and in that table, it clearly shows the quantity demanded of a good and the different prices. Thus, given the price level, it is easy to determine the expected quantity demand. So the example is, if the price of a chocolate bar is, for instance, 5 Rand, then the quantity demanded could be 10. If you look at the table here. So this table here basically states that is the demand schedule. Okay, this table here. So if we look at the price of a chocolate bar, if it's 5 Rand, then the quantity demanded could be 10. But if the price of a chocolate bar is 20 Rand, then the quantity demanded may be 1. This demand schedule also states the law of demand. As you can see, if the price is low, then the quantity demanded is more. But if the price increases, then you can see that the quantity demanded also decreases. So if price is high, demand will be low. If price is low, demand will be high. And we can see that in this table here. And this table is called the demand schedule. The price at the quantity demanded. So now we're going to look at the graphical illustration of the demand curve. As you know, we've already looked at the demand schedule, which is the table that shows us the price against the quantity demanded. Now we need to take that information and put it into a graphical illustration. So what is the graphical illustration of the demand curve? It's a graph that shows the quantity of goods and services that consumers are willing and able to purchase at different price levels. And this is known as demand curve. Demand curves usually slope down from left to right, as you can see that. Now, I usually teach my learners that the word for demand in Afrikaans is vraag. And when you write a vraag, it's written with the letter V. And if you start writing the letter V, you start at the top and you slope down. So you can remember that in the future when you study, that when you see this line on the graphical illustration, you know it's the demand curve. It slopes down from the left to the right. Now, this characteristic shape that slopes down from the left to right is a result of the law of demand. And if you can remember, what does the law of demand say again? If price increases, demand will decrease. Okay. A demand curve is created by plotting the data from the demand schedule on the graph. Here is an example. Here we find the demand schedule. Here's all the prices and here's the quantity demanded. Now we need to take this information and plot it on a demand curve or a graphical illustration of the demand curve. Now this is typically done in an L-shape graphical representation. The horizontal line here, as you can see with the laser pointer, this is our x-axis. The vertical line here is our y-axis. Price is always listed on the y-axis and quantity demanded is always listed on the x-axis. Okay, so now you take the information, you draw your line, the y-axis and the x-axis. The y-axis is the price and the x-axis is the quantity demanded. Now you go to the demand schedule and you look at the price of bread. It starts with 2 rand, then 4 rand, 6 rand, 8 rand, 10 rand and 12 rand. So now remember that your price and your quantity should always be in numerical order. So we always start with 0. First we have 2 rand. Then we have 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 and 14 rand. That is in numerical order. Then the quantity demanded is also in numerical order from 2 to 10 if we count in twos. So it's 2 rand, 4 rand, 6 rand, 8 rand, 10 rand and 12 rand. Okay, so we're going to plot the first price against quantity demanded. For the price of 2 rand, the quantity demanded will be 10 bags of bread. Okay, so we look for 2 rand and we look for 10 and then we plot it. Then secondly, For 4 rand, the quantity demanded is 8 bags of bread. So then we go and we look at 8, the quantity. For 4 rand, we combine them and we plot them. And then for 6 rand, the quantity demanded will be 6 bags. So then we look for 6, there's 6 on the y-axis, and we look for 6 bags of bread on the x-axis. There it is, and then we dot it. And then we continue with this whole table. I will explain it again on a separate video. Until you have all your dots, then you connect it and then you will see the demand curve formed. And this is a graphical illustration of the demand curve. So I'm going to just show you 2 rand for 10 bags. Okay, there. 4 rand for 8 bags. 6 rand for 6 bags. There it is. As you can see. 8 rand for 4 bags. There it is. 10 rand for 2 bags. 10 rand for 2 bags. There it is. And then 12 rand for 0. There's the 0, 12 rand, and then you make your dot. Then after you've done this, then you connect the lines. It has already been done here in this graph, but then you connect all the lines, or the dots, and then you will see that automatically it will form your demand curve. Demand curve. And that is how you do a demand curve. As I said, I will explain it again in a separate video. Now we're going to look at supply. What is supply? Now, as you can remember, the demand curve sloped from the left-hand side down to the bottom right. Let me show you. Okay, the demand curve was from the top left down to the right, but the supply curve goes from the bottom to the right hand up, as you can see. That is the supply curve. So what is supply? Supply is defined as the quantity of a good or service that suppliers are willing and able to produce. So the supply comes from the supplier that produces stuff or sells goods and services. So the supply of a good or service is determined by certain factors. Now, firstly, it's the price of the product that will determine the supply. And we will get to the law of supply as well, and then you will understand that. And then secondly, the cost of production will also determine the supply. The method of production, we have different types of methods. Is it mass production where we produce a lot of goods at once? Or is it batch production where we only have batches? Or is it jobbing where we create something specifically for a client? That will also determine the supply. Then the number of producers will also determine the supply. So let's look at the law of supply. As you can remember, the law of demand is that if the price increases, the demand will decrease. If the price decreases, the demand will increase. But the law of supply works differently. The quantity of a good that a producer is willing and able to supply depends in part on the price of the good. If the price is low, producers will only be willing to supply a low quantity of the good. When the price is high, producers are willing to supply a greater quantity. So if price increases, supply will also increase, and vice versa. If supply decreases, then supply will also decrease. And that is the law of supply. Now, as we were discussing the demand schedule, we also get a supply schedule. And this is also a table that contains values for the price and the quantity that would be supplied at that specific price. Now, let us quickly look. If the selling price of a chocolate bar is R5, then the quantity supply would only be 4. If the price of a chocolate bar is R20, then the quantity supply could be 25 bars. Okay, so this is a supply schedule. So we're going to use this information to plot on the L graph for the supply curve. So now we're going to look at the graphical illustration of the supply curve. A graph can also be used to illustrate how much of a particular good producers are prepared to provide at different prices. A graph that shows the quantity of a good or service that producers are willing and able to provide at different price levels is known as the supply curve, which states that as the price of goods increase, suppliers will attempt to increase profits also by increasing the quantity that they want to sell. A supply curve is created by plotting the data from the supply schedule, that table, onto the graph. So if we use the supply schedule of the chocolate bar supplied at different prices, then our supply curve will look as follows. For 25 cents, we are willing to supply 100 apples. So on the graph, you have to go to your price, which is 25 cents, and you have to look for your quantity, which is 100 apples. And then you have to connect the two and then provide a dot. And you're going to do that for each and every price of apples and quantity supplied. Create the dots and then connect them, and then the line will form. Okay, I will explain this in another video. Okay, so what is market equilibrium? We're going to now talk about equilibrium. Previously, we've already spoken about the demand curve and the supply curve. Now we're going to speak about the equilibrium point. Now, as you can see on this graph, this is the price line and this is the quantity line. Price is on the y-axis and quantity is on the x-axis. This is our demand curve and this is our supply curve. Where they meet or intersect, the middle point, is our equilibrium point. Now, what does that mean? Price formation or price determination takes place where the market forces of supply and demand reach a balance or an equilibrium point. This equilibrium point is the equilibrium price for a product. The equilibrium point also gives the equilibrium or the balance quantity, that is, how many units of the product consumers will want to buy and suppliers will want to provide. The market is in equilibrium or in balance if the demand equals the supply. Okay, so demand equals supply in equilibrium. Here we have an example. Here's your schedule. Okay, we have the price, we have the quantity demanded, we have the quantity supplied. Now, as you can see here, at 6 Rand for a kilogram of sugar, the quantity demanded is 50 and the quantity supplied is 10. These two are not the same. So these two are not in balance. The same here, the same here, and the same here. But if you look at 12 Rand, the quantity demanded is 30 and the quantity supply is 30. This is our equilibrium point. It's where the demand equals the supply. So if we need to determine what the price for a product will be. Let's say you are a supplier and you need to determine what is the correct price for your product. Then the typical equilibrium will be the price. Okay, so if you charge 12 Rand, then your consumers will buy the product because 12 Rand is what you are willing to supply and what they are willing to demand or to pay for a kilogram of sugar. And obviously, after you have drawn your demand curve and your supply curve, you will be able to determine what the equilibrium is. But by looking at the schedule here, you will automatically see that this is the equilibrium because the demand equals the supply.